Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. So today's topic is the philosophy of sound, and I actually got inspired to do this topic from another podcast episode by Emergence Magazine. This is not the first time this has happened.
Yeah.
Emergence Magazine always inspires my topics, and it's funny because they're not even related to like neuroscience. They're usually related to ecology. But it was this really cool episode that I highly recommend, where it was like a history of the planet in terms of sound. So like what the earth sounded like before there were animals, and then the creation of like animals over evolution and how that changed and how the sounds of the planet changed. And it just made me really think about like how continuous sound is. There isn't really, even in silence, you know, there is sound, and it's just such a big part of our experience as humans. So in this episode, I want to discuss and probe what is sound, and how do we define sound? Does it exist without being perceived by us? Is it a subject or an object? Is it an individual? Like all of these sorts of questions.
Sounds so interesting.
Let's get into it.
Yes.
So to begin, the philosophy of sound has been sort of explored by a few philosophers, but I don't think it's the biggest subset of philosophy. But there are three kind of main categories for conceptualizing sound. The first are more classical theories called medial theories, and this is backed up by Galileo, who said that sounds are made and heard by us when the air is ruffled and moves certain cartilages of a tympanum in our ear, and Descartes, who said what we hear are not objects themselves but movements coming from them. And so the feature of medial theories is that sound requires a medium to travel between the sounding object and the hearer.
Or the listener.
Yeah, I was like, I'm going to struggle with this word for the whole episode. Is there a synonym?
Yeah.
The listener, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas proximal theories are another like main category. These state that sounds are sensations and sounds are heard where the listener is. And so regardless of where the sound originates, that doesn't define the sound. What defines the sound is where it is heard. So, for example, if a sound is made in a room and there's 100 people in the room, that can be considered 100 sounds because everybody hears something different.
Mm-hmm. And also another feature of that proximal theory is that, for example, if there's a motorbike and it does a sound, whether you're close to the motorbike or far away from the motorbike, and how you hear the sound is what matters, not like the motorbike noise itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the third large category, I think is the most interesting maybe, distal theories. They are based on the premise that sounds are properties of material objects like colors or shapes. So I really want to discuss this further later, the comparison between sounds and colors, because yeah, there's a lot of like differences that make us really question perception. I think what I find most interesting is how many different ways you can view sound, because yeah, I naturally and intuitively think, when I think of sound, as being a wave.
Me too.
Like a more material, physical account of sound.
Yeah, a medium.
Well, I see the medium more as like air.
Yeah.
And the sound waves travel through air.
Yeah.
But then as a neuroscientist, also thinking about how auditory perception works and how sound information is carried through our bodies to the brain, what's super interesting is that sounds travel as waves, but when they also hit our ears, as Galileo said, they also cause physical vibrations in our inner ear structures, and that is how sound is transmitted through like transforming sound waves into physical vibrations of certain frequencies and amplitudes of biological structures that then cause certain patterns of neurons to fire, etc., etc. So then what I was thinking is, where do sounds begin and end? Which also touches on the question, are sounds an individual?
Yeah.
Because as we've discussed in our very first episode, when we were saying what is an individual, we were asking where does one thing begin and end, another thing begin and end. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that idea, or that question about whether sound is an individual. And it's tricky because in the terms of like the proximal theory about whether it's something relational in terms of space, and maybe it begins where the listener is, or with the medium, and that, like, for me, I think that the thing that I find most interesting about the medial features is that it requires a medium to travel. So whether it's air or maybe even water, like if you're underwater, you can still hear noises.
Yeah.
And so for me, that gives it a more continuous spectrum, which I think I relate to more in our arguments about individuality and how it's all just a spectrum, and it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly where we stop being just a lump of cells and start being a person.
And we can be both, right?
Yeah.
Like a cell can be a cell, but a cell can also be part of a body.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be human, but we can also be part of a community, and those can all be individuals in their own way.
Yeah.
But with sound, it's like, so what I was kind of trying to get at is a movement is required to initiate a sound. Like if you hear the sound of something fall from a table, then it's basically a transfer of energy.
Mm-hmm.
You need like energy to move the object, which then leads to the object banging against something else, which releases sound, which then travels to your ear, which then vibrates things in your body, which then leads to neuronal firing, which you could argue has a sound of its own, and then that leads to behavior. So sound really encapsulates or makes you reflect on the continuous movement of energy, essentially. Yes. And like transfer of energy into different forms.
Yeah, I really like that idea that it's like just a conversion of energy from like one modality to another. Just relating it back to individuality, we also spoke about whether the ocean as a whole can be considered an individual or sentient. And so that for me has a lot of parallels with sound, with the waves of the ocean and the sound wave. But also, one argument against the medial theory is about different hertz and how you can have a specific wavelength and hertz of sound, but then you can have this same hertz, like 20 hertz, within things like ultrasounds or infrasounds, and these aren't really perceived. It's beyond our human capabilities of perceiving them. And so I wanted to raise the question whether these do count as sounds, and at what point does, again, a sound begin and a sound end?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I also love this point because that also emphasizes that sounds are waves, but also that sounds are not, right? Because ultrasounds are sounds to some animals who can hear that very high frequency. But as humans, we are limited. And it also relates to all sorts of perception, because it's the same for visual perception. There could be 1,000 more colors that we cannot perceive because of our nervous system, essentially. And so sounds require waves, but not all wavelengths are sounds. It depends on your perspective, basically, because obviously we come from a human perspective. And so I agree that the strongest arguments for what are sounds to us is that it requires the listener. Like basically more similar to the proximal theories that emphasize sounds being what is heard, not what causes the sound.
Yeah.
Whereas the sound waves maybe are just the cause of a sound, but they don't define the sound. But a good argument for the medial theories of sound is that properties of sound waves correspond to properties of sound. So the amplitude of a sound wave corresponds to how loud it is, perceived as, and the frequency of the sound wave corresponds to the pitch. But then, like I just said, perhaps if sounds are purely defined by what is perceived by the listener, and sound waves are required for sound but not sufficient.
But not necessarily.
No, they are necessary but not sufficient. Okay. That's what I've been trying to say, yes. So sound waves are necessary for sound, but they're not sufficient because you also need the listener and you need a nervous system that enables us to perceive the specific frequency.
Yeah. And that really reminds me of what we talked about in our color episode about humans being a substrate or a vessel for the properties of sound to like latch upon, and then and therefore have this phenomenological experience of sound.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I also like to view it, because as you mentioned with the ocean even, waves are all around us, not only in sound, but also in just the way things move. Brain waves are also a thing, like neural activity happens in wave-like patterns.
But then could you argue everything is sound? Everything that's a wave can be a sound?
But no.
At the right pitch or at the right, with the right substrate?
Well, yeah, maybe with the right substrate, which also raises this other point, which is, can there be sound in a vacuum? Which there can't, because the waves cannot travel. So, I mean, unless the sound is the listener, you know?
Yeah.
In a vacuum, which isn't really possible, then...
Well, that brings me to a point that I wanted to ask. Well, what about, like, hallucinations or the internal monologues? These are, like, these, you could say, have, like, auditory qualities, and yet they're almost self-generated, and it doesn't have an external source. So does sound need to originate from an external source and be that conversion of energy, like you talked about? Or could it just be, like, an internal generation of sound?
Right, that's a really good point, and I actually didn't think about that.
And then it raises the question, how would you then be able to differentiate between what is internally generated and what is exterior sound?
Yeah, so now we go into the philosophy of mind. Does the world around us even exist, or are we just hallucinating reality?
Sure, but I didn't want to go into the philosophy of mind. I wanted to talk about, internal monologues.
Well, yeah, so what I would say is, well, what I would ask in response to that is, would a human being with no prior experience of sound be able to hallucinate sound? Because what led me to that thought is, to me, like, hallucinations are essentially when neural activity that occurs when there is a sensory stimulus occurs without a sensory stimulus.
Yeah.
And that leads to the same perception of having a sensory experience.
Yeah.
Neuroimaging studies have shown that there's, like, the same brain regions are active when a hallucination occurs.
But how does it get triggered? Like, how...
I guess it depends on the situation. I don't know, like, actually about auditory hallucinations. But, and of course, like, internal monologues are very different to hallucinations, and those are more, like, consciously initiated, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I was actually having a discussion about internal monologues with a few people in my lab, and we realized that there's quite a wide spectrum of those that have no internal monologues, like zero auditory stimuli, all the way to those, like, and then there's more of a middle ground where there is an internal monologue, but there isn't that much of an auditory quality, which I don't really understand how that works. And then there's me, who I definitely have a very strong internal monologue, and you could argue maybe even a dialogue, because sometimes I argue with my own internal monologue. And so it has a very, very vivid auditory quality. And so I don't know, I wonder the range of experiences that people can have, and whether from, like, on the one side there's no internal monologue, to the other maybe hallucinations, and whether perhaps we don't need to be exposed to an auditory stimuli given it's almost like internally generated.
Yeah. So do you literally hear yourself speaking in your head?
Yes. It's like, it has an auditory quality, whereas I know for other people there isn't an auditory quality. They've described it as more of like a written quality.
Yeah, because I would say that I don't actually hear myself speaking in my head. That would be super annoying.
It is. But when you read a book, isn't there like a mini you speaking?
Yeah, so okay. But it's not like I'm hearing myself speak. I don't I don't hear my accent. I don't hear. Yeah, it's different. It's the same as comparing, like, seeing something and visualizing or imagining something.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure, because I'm quite a visual person. So when I read a book, rather than, like, hearing the words being read, I imagine what's being described visually.
I think I do both.
Yeah. But I wouldn't say that, like, so I wouldn't compare, whereas with visual imagination, it's more comparable to what I see, but with inner monologues, I wouldn't call it sound, personally. Like, I don't hear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about to those that do hear it, though? And I looked it up, a third of the people do hear it.
Then it's sound. I mean, I think ultimately the philosophy of sound, the philosophy of color, the philosophy of touch, is that a thing?
Sure.
Like the philosophy of
Sensations.
anything perceptual, I think is down to
The vessel?
the perceiver. Yeah,
Okay.
the vessel. I still very much view the nervous system as having the fundamental function of acting as essentially like a radio to the world around us, under the assumption that there is a physical world around us. And whatever we experience is just related to how we are tuned to that world.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to what I mentioned earlier, the differences between sound and color, because we've also done a previous episode on the philosophy of color, so it's interesting to compare, because I think these are the most enigmatic, like, perceptual experiences we can have. The main difference is the spatio-temporal difference. So, which is also like just a difference between the visual and auditory systems in general. So, colors are not dynamic, whereas sounds are. Sounds take up time. Sounds have temporality, but colors do not. And we have a temporal experience of sound. Sound defines time, in a way. Like, imagine if everything in this world was sped up, like all the sound in the world was sped up, then your perception of time would also be different.
Yeah.
And we use time to segregate sounds. Like, what's the difference between this word I'm saying and the next is time, whereas colors are separated by spatially. Like, this object is green and this object is red.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I also thought of sound as being sound relating very closely to time and the passing of time, and it does fill up the space in a different way. And if you compare it to numbers or objects, it's very clear that, like, I don't know, a square has this shape, and if you do like 2 by 2, that's also a square. Whereas with sound, you need to allow the time to pass in order to figure out what someone's sentence is. So yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, and it's really interesting. And you said that the passing of time is pretty much perceived due to the passing of sound and the frequency of the sound. But then let me challenge you with that and also ask, what if it's about silence? So the way that we can distinguish between sounds is due to the lack of sound. If we all said like all of the words at the same time, it wouldn't make any sense. But we need the silence and the space between the words in order to be able to make sense of sound and the time that it takes for it to pass.
Okay, I agree with you in a linguistic manner. Like, every language does have some space between sounds. And also music. Like,
Yeah.
music is never completely continuous. There's always some sort of break. But then, to counter that, I actually don't really believe silence exists.
Yeah. Of course you don't.
Yes, because this is something I also thought of.
Well, then is silence a vacuum? Is that the equivalent?
Yeah, so I think silence could exist in a vacuum. But
I'm
we
saying, is silence a vacuum?
Well, no, I wouldn't say silence is a vacuum. I would say a vacuum is silent.
Okay.
Silence is a property of a vacuum.
Ah, okay, I see.
But it doesn't really matter because we don't live in a vacuum.
Yeah, well then if we don't live in a vacuum, then what is silence? And since it just occurred when I made a pause between
Yeah,
my
so
words.
I mean, I think we refer to silence as a lack of obvious sound. But I just wrote in my notes, what about white noise?
Yeah.
And that was actually in relation to a question, do all sounds belong, like a question I was asking myself, do all sounds belong or originate from an object? And I didn't think of what you mentioned about hallucinations and internal monologues. But yeah, I also was thinking then about white noise and where does that come from? And if you sit in silence, so to speak, you can almost hear like what I can only describe as particles.
Yeah.
I feel like you can hear Brownian motion, even though I know it's not brown. Well, I don't know if it's Brownian motion, but
It could be pink noise.
yeah, could be pink noise, could be brown noise, could be blue noise,
White noise.
Yeah. Well, white noise. So like white is just because it contains all the wavelengths, isn't it? It's like white light contains all the wavelengths. Okay, this leads me perfectly to my next point. It's all linked, but I know I didn't even answer your question, but
No, that's all right. I'm just posing it
yeah, we're
to
just
the universe.
posing thoughts and questions
Yeah,
here.
you can answer them.
Yeah. But back to color and sound. So white light contains all wavelengths in roughly the same proportion, and then this allows objects to reflect some of the lights, which gives off color, which is what we perceive. And so some people may define colors as dispositions to reflect light in a certain manner. So this is another perspective on the philosophy of sound, is the dispositional view. And similarly to color, you may argue that sound is a disposition of an object, like an inherent property of an object, whereby any object will resonate at specific frequencies and reveal the vibratory mode of this object through giving off sound, which is what we perceive. So a philosopher, Kulvicki, in 2008 said that sounds are dispositions of objects to vibrate in response to being stimulated. Sounds are perceived as being transient, but they are not in fact transient. And so this is kind of like in the philosophy of color episode that we did, I remember talking about one view of color being that color is always there, but it's only revealed by light. And so there's this same view can be applied to sound, but it's less intuitively correct, I would say.
Yeah.
That like sound is always there and is only revealed by an object.
Yeah.
When a physical aberration of the object initiates it.
Yeah, I think for me the key difference is that with, as you mentioned, with white light and what we perceive as colors is due to reflecting the colors such as green. So like with a leaf, the color green is revealed because that's the only color that it reflects back. But then I think with sound, the difference is that, like you said, maybe there's like a constant white noise, and whatever we perceive as sound is just the difference of like certain wavelengths with another, and we only really perceive the differences in the frequencies and the waves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that. Like sound always exists, but how we define it is changes in it.
We only take notice of it when there's a change. And I think that's similar to like neural activity, in that there's a constant level of noise, and then we notice spikes when there's something interesting happening.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. I guess we've both kind of agreed from our side that sound has more to do with the perceiver, the listener, than to do with what initiates it.
Yeah.
Especially because of
our
hallucination.
Background.
Yeah, I think it is because of our neuroscience background, because
without the biology, there's no phenomenology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then obviously it's also valid to say that sound, color could be properties of the world. I just think that as human beings, that would be a bit of a big step to attribute it as like being a purely a property of the world, when we can't even be sure that the world exists outside of us.
Yeah, and also whether or not other animals or beings would have like a completely different sense perception to us.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is we can only define it based on our experience of it, and so we have to take that into account, and so it has to do with perception. Although I'm not denying that there are also like physical, innate ways to define it. I just think there's ironically more evidence for our subjective experience of it.
I don't know if there's more evidence for our subjective experience of it, but it's the only evidence we have access to.
No, there's more. Evidence isn't the right word. Like there's a stronger definition of sound would be one based on our subjective experience, because that is what we know. Yeah,
I mean, I think maybe we can define sound in the same way that we arrive at conclusions in science, in that this is what we know with the means that we know, but we acknowledge that it may not be like the whole truth. So within our faculties and capabilities, we can define sound as such, but recognize that perhaps it could be something else. Like it could be a property of the object, or it could be a property of the medium, or it could be a property of biology, but we don't know which. But the closest thing we can be sure of is our own perception.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm like now doubting myself, because I think you said this in the first episode as well. it's a really famous example. Do sounds exist if they're not heard? Like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it still make a sound?
See, I would still feel like it does.
Yeah, I know. Of course, you can't just be like, no, actually, I need to be there.
Yeah, exactly. Like the wave, like, yeah, the vibration still happens, the transfer of energy still happens, which is why I think I agree way more with the medial view.
Yeah, I still believe sound has a physical basis in the form of waves. But not all waves are sound.
Yeah.
Waves are necessary, but not sufficient for sound. But then what is sufficient? You know, because, for example, like we've already mentioned, because now we're going in circles, really high or really low frequencies of waves cannot be heard by us, but they may be heard by other animals. So then we wouldn't say that if 100 hertz frequency happens on the other side of the world, it's still a sound. Would we say that? No, because we're human and we can't hear it even if we were there. So, but because we know that we can hear a tree fall as human beings, we would say that this sound exists, which is why we are just so limited by our human experience, which is why our definition of sound will always be based on our human experience, which is why we might as well embrace that and define it as being requiring a perceiver. But then you could argue, I guess I would argue, that it requires any perceiver.
Yeah.
So
I would be more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And like, even if we can't hear the frequency, an animal may be able to hear it. So as long as some biological being can perceive it, maybe then I'd count it as a sound.
Yeah. But like, can sound hear sound?
What?
Does it require a nervous system? I hate thinking that, because...
What do you mean, can sound hear sound? What do you mean, does it require a nervous system?
Does it require like a biological nervous system?
I'm gonna say anything that's biological matter, I think, can perceive sound because it can't interact with sound. Like, wasn't there a study that said that like plants would grow in a specific way depending on the auditory stimuli it received?
Yeah, we can't be certain that it's hearing.
Yeah, but the sound waves may be affecting its growth in a specific way.
But would you say that plants see? Because plants' growth is affected by sunlight.
Yeah, but that's different because it's more like eating.
It's not that different though, because I'm sure people have studied how plants grow differently in different types of light, like different colored light.
Yeah.
So that's
colors. But I still feel like it's more like you're eating different colored apples. Like, it's still food. Okay, but I
get what you mean.
I stand by my point. But even if it's not sound, there's a transfer of energy happening. There's a sound waves that are interacting with the plant. We are limited to our human faculties of saying, oh, it's sound, it's auditory, but maybe for them, they're still interacting with sound waves, but it's something else for them.
But if we were interacting with different waves, and we couldn't hear, like, so you say you were raised in an environment where there was always infrasound, but we didn't perceive it. It might affect our growth, but can you say that we are hearing? No. Because we're limited by our nervous systems.
Yeah.
So we can't be sure that sound as we know it exists without a nervous system, since we know there is a neural contribution to sound perception.
Yeah. But I just think just because we could call it a different name in terms of whatever plants are doing when they interact with sound waves doesn't mean that it's not happening. Like, we call it sound because that's how we perceive it and the phenomenological experience that we have, but maybe plants, it interacts with them in terms of growth, and maybe for them, if they were sentient, maybe they wouldn't call it sound, maybe they'd call it something else, but it would be the same property affecting them.
But then how do you define, like, what's the
it's
same
impossible.
effect? Like, do you define it by the effect? Do you define it by, the question is, do you define it by the source or the destination? Like, I was also thinking, when you stimulate neurons in neuroscience, if you stimulate them at a certain frequency, would you say that the neuron can hear?
No.
Like, or even just playing music to biological tissue, like organoids.
Yeah, no, I think there was a study about that as well.
What? organoids?
No. Playing like specific frequencies, maybe at organoids or like certain cells and how it affected their growth. But again, it's probably just to do with the frequencies as opposed to like it being a sound.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know.
I don't
It's
know.
a big question mark for me.
Yeah. I mean, there will never be an answer for like philosophy of perception, I think, because it ultimately comes down to philosophy of mind also,
Of
which there are
course.
no answers to.
Yeah.
So let's leave it at that.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this whirlwind of trying to
Thoughts and feelings and questions
and dissecting what sound is. Let us know what your opinions are.
all while listening to a temporal pattern of our voices produced by us on Neuroverse.
And perceived by you.
Yeah. Wow, what a beautiful way to end today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed it. And do be sure to check out our Instagram and Twitter at neuroverse_pod, and also our website, neuroversepod.com, for all of the resources for our episodes.
Thank you so much for listening.